I had the golden age of journalism when newspapers had loads of money and they'd send you off anywhere at a drop of a hat, and did.
You were quite hopeful about what was happening in Iran. You thought that the regime could be overthrown.
I think the regime was that close to being overthrown.
What do you think happened in Syria? Why did that regime collapse so quickly in the end?
With your help, we did story after story on her. And
it became an international
story.
Did.
We got Brazil offered her refuge, and it worked. We saved her. About 10 o'clock that night, all the mobile system went down, the internet went down, and we looked out of the windows and there were troops pouring onto the streets.
Do you still think that the regime in Iran will be overthrown?
A fateful encounter that I've been trying to shake you off ever since without much luck. It was the first time in the 225-year-odd history of the Times that father and daughter had ever had a front-page joint byline. He said, look, don't panic, don't worry, but your father's been arrested in Homs. My daughter said, oh, he'll love that. That's he'll get a really good story out of this. They did a sort of good cop, bad cop. One guy was threatening me, the other was trying to cajole me. It was extraordinary. I mean, there wasn't a dry eye anywhere in Chile, let alone in the Atacama Desert. It was as close to a miracle as I've ever seen. First rule of journalism, you don't know what you don't know. If you're in doubt, go somewhere. You always find out something you didn't know. And that's the America that Trump very astutely tapped into. No one had paid it much attention before, but he did.
Mustn't say that. I'm really a nice thug.
There you are, you're a nice thug.
Welcome to another episode of You Decide. Today I have the pleasure of having Martin Fletcher, a journalist with an illustrious career who was the former foreign editor and political correspondent of the Times of London. Welcome to the show, Martin. And to begin with, I just wanted to tell the audience about how we met. Do you remember how we met?
I do. I was about to go off to cover the Iranian presidential election of 2009, and there was a presidential debate the evening before I flew, and I wanted to watch it. I wanted to know what was happening, and I didn't speak Farsi. So I called someone at the School of Oriental and African Studies who put me in touch with you. A fateful encounter that I've been trying to shake you off ever since without much luck. So I remember I came up to your house somewhere in the outer reaches of North London, and we watched the debate and you translated it for me. And
then after that you went to Iran?
Well, I think it was the next day I went to Iran. I mean, the debate was interesting because it was a proper debate. It was a genuine debate. There was the opposition in the form of Mir Hussein Mousavi was having, he was actually laying into Ahmadinejad, the president. It was,
and vice versa, actually.
There was nothing contrived about it. And that was the tone for the next week. We had an amazing week in Iran where, there were huge government rallies, but there were huge opposition rallies, and people could say anything and did say anything. It was probably as unguarded as Iran has been in the 30 years since the revolution.
And you were detained.
It really did appear to be democracy in action until the actual result.
And you were covering the story of the protest, and you were detained and you were kicked out, as were the other foreign journalists from Iran.
So the election was on the Friday, I think it was June the 15th, and we'd had this amazing week. And I remember about 10 o'clock that night, the mobile system went down, the internet went down, and we looked out of the windows and there were troops pouring onto the streets. And far earlier than we had expected, the regime announced the result of the election, which was Ahmadinejad, I think it was something like 66%, Mousavi 34%, which was, if they had said 52-48, it'd have been harder to challenge. But that was so obviously ridiculous given the strength of support we'd seen for Mousavi. So we knew the election was being stolen. And then the next day we went out on the streets, and wherever groups of Mousavi supporters gathered, they were being literally attacked by Basiji they would ride up on their motor scooters and beat them with truncheons and sticks. It was tragic to watch because there'd been so much excitement and enthusiasm during the week before, and you just saw people's hopes dashed, their rights being demolished in front of your eyes. My cameraman, my photographer, was arrested for taking photographs of protesters being beaten up and held for a couple of hours. I was briefly detained for taking a leaflet from an opposition activist. I mean, we were just down the side street and I was reading it and we were sort of marched in, but they let us go. But then on the Monday morning, almost all the Western reporters were rounded up, taken to the airport and booted out. And that's the last time I ever went to Iran.
And then since then, we worked together for many years where I was helping with all the Iran stories. And we did have a lot of stories in the Times at the time, didn't we?
Well,
but before going to all the stories that we had, you were quite hopeful about what was happening in Iran. You thought that the regime could be overthrown.
Well, yes, and I think the regime was that close to being overthrown. It's one of those great what ifs. If the demonstrators, those first few days, instead of going home each night, if it stayed on the streets, I mean, there were reports that the Ayatollahs had sort of booked planes to fly out of the country. My sense was, I may be wrong. I mean, bear in mind I was in Tehran, which is obviously a Mousavi stronghold, and there were millions of sort of poor, pious peasants elsewhere who supported Ahmadinejad, but. Yeah, they were vast protests. The Green Movement, for a while, it was a genuine threat to the regime.
We had so many front page stories, didn't we? And
the story, I just felt, I'd seen what had happened. I felt it viscerally. It upset me. I became emotionally involved, and I was determined to keep the story going, and you became my partner in crime. Yeah, you're right. But if you remember, I flew back on the Monday. Later that week, I went into the office one morning and my phone went, and it was someone I knew, not you. This is someone else saying Nada Sultan had been shot on the streets of Tehran. She was a very beautiful 26-year-old student, and she died on the pavement. You could see her dying. There was this video, and it went absolutely viral. It went round the world. This was the face of Iran, the face of the opposition. And there was a doctor with her. And the regime tried to make out that she'd been shot by her own side, by the opposition. And the only person who could gainsay that was this doctor who had been with her when she died. And so I went into the office and I got this call saying the doctor has fled to Britain, where he was actually studying at Oxford. And his first name was Arash, and he was a friend of Paulo Coelho, the Brazilian novelist. And my daughter was a trainee on the Times at that time. And I said to her, how on earth am I going to find him? And she said, leave it to me, Dad, I'll find him. And she did, within an hour or two. But he was terrified of talking to us because he had family back in Tehran and he was afraid of the reprisals. And he hummed and hawed all day. And finally, late in the afternoon, he said, okay, I'll talk to you. And he did. And we extracted his story, and he confirmed that Nada Sultan had been shot by the regime. And we wrote a front page splash, the main story on the front page, and we wrote two pages on this inside. It was a big, big story at that time.
I think it was the first time that a father and daughter had a front page story.
Yeah, so the last thing we did was we had to decide how to byline it. Was it going to be by Martin Fletcher and Hannah Fletcher, or Martin and Hannah Fletcher, or Hannah and Martin Fletcher? And we finally decided by Martin Fletcher and Hannah Fletcher. And you're right, it was the first time in the 225-year-odd history of the Times that father and daughter had ever had a front page joint byline. We went home really excited about this. Hannah went back to her flat, I went back to my house. About 10 o'clock that evening, Hannah called me and she said, guess what? I said, what? She said, Michael Jackson's died. And I said, don't worry, that won't knock us off of the front. Of course, they completely ripped up the whole paper. And our story got reduced to sort of 500 words. But it did make the first edition, which goes to the outer islands of Scotland, the fringes of Britain. And I still have that. It's still framed in my loo back at home.
But unfortunately, the regime wasn't overthrown. But that didn't stop us to write more stories about Iran. And there was do you remember the story of that woman that was going to be stoned? And the Times were really active in publicising.
Can you remember her name?
Yeah, Sakina Ashtiani,
Yeah. So Ashtiani was, I think she was a sort of poorly educated woman from Tabriz in northern Iran. And she had been accused of adultery. And she had already served, if you remember, 5 years in prison and had 99 lashes. And she'd now been sentenced to death by stoning. And we had an editor, James Harding, who seized on this story. And he said, right, we're going to save her. And with your help, we did story after story on her. And it was a front page story. We did petitions. We got people like William Hague and John Kerry, the Foreign Secretary and the US Secretary of State, to weigh in. And we got...
It became an international story.
We got Brazil offered her refuge.
Yes.
And it worked. We saved her. Yeah. She was never stoned.
No, she was released and she was spared,
Yeah. Talking of which, Mousavi, I think, is still under house arrest, isn't he?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, extraordinary.
And his wife.
Yeah. But, his Ashtiani's lawyer had to flee to Norway. His wife was arrested back in Tehran. Do you remember we went out
to Norway? Yeah,
we went out to Norway and
Oslo.
interviewed Mustafi, and when his wife was finally released, we covered their reunion. So we kept the story going for a year or two, and then the Arab Spring happened.
Well, just before going to the Arab Spring, there's one of the things I remember about in Norway when we were waiting in the airport. I saw at first hand your competitiveness because there was all these other reporters, and they'd heard of you, they're coming to you, and they were trying to praise you and get into a conversation with them, but you were just focused on the story at no time for anyone else.
Well, I felt we had first dibs at that because it was the Times that saved Ashtiani.
Yeah, but Iran wasn't the only country that you covered. You've covered many countries. I think you've travelled to so many countries. I won't even probably be able to name them. But I mean, to really troubled spots like Syria, like Libya, like Somalia, Chile, everywhere that you can think of. You were on the plane all the time. You were like, you never know. In fact, Martin, I met Ian Black, who was like your equivalent in The Guardian at the time, at some reception. And then I mentioned your name, saying that, I worked with you on the Iran stories and that. And I thought he'd be your competitor or something. But he actually spoke very highly of you. And he said that you were friends. Your children went to the same school or something. And he was saying how energetic you are. He was saying like this Martin is just unbelievable. He's playing sports. He's like flying around the globe. He never stops. And I was quite surprised because I thought journalists are normally very sort of rivals and competitive with each other. But he spoke very highly of you. But Syria was another hotspot that you went to. And you went there just when the protests in Syria had started.
Funny enough, my son had been studying Arabic in Damascus in 2009. And we'd all gone out on holiday. We had a family holiday there, and we went round, Aleppo and the souks and Bushehr and all the sites, Palmyra, never thinking that 2 years later I'd be going back to cover the war there, which I did.
When you went there the first time, you never thought there'd be any protests here. The regime looked really secure, yeah.
Yes,
and completely
we were talking.
controlled.
It was the Damascus Spring. Assad was seen as a reformer. The Western tourists were pouring in. There were sort of cafes and coffee shops everywhere. No, I never thought I'd be coming back. So, the first time I went back was I'm trying to remember I think the uprising began in March, and I went about 2 or 3 months later, by which time, all the tourists had vanished. And I wasn't foreign editor at the time, but Richard Beeson, who was, said, try and get in. And I thought there's no chance, no way I'll get in. So I flew to Beirut and took a taxi across the border. And
which was quite risky.
Yeah. Well, I never, even at the border post, I thought they're going to turn me away. They're not going to let me in. I wasn't going as a journalist. I said I was a teacher on a sabbatical. And I cleared my laptop, and I don't think I even took a laptop with me, actually, and to my horror, they let me in. So I went to Damascus, and I had 4 or 5 days just traveling around. I was literally the only Westerner there, but I thought this can't last. And it didn't, because I went to Homs. I went around all the places I'd been 2 years previously as a tourist and sort of report on what happened. Then I went to Homs, which was more or less the sort of the heartbeat of the uprising, full of Sunnis. And I spent several hours driving around the streets with a friendly taxi driver, and we ran into a roadblock. And they saw me and they took me in, they being the intelligence services. And I was taken to the intelligence service HQ in Homs, down into a basement, where I was held for quite a number of hours, I think about 6 hours. And as I was held, I could see all these any young man of sort of fighting age was being taken in. They removed their belts and their shoelaces and they put them in a room at the end. And every time they opened the door to the room, I could see there were sort of scores and scores of young men in there. And they were being rounded up. And it was early on in the uprising. I didn't think I was going to be locked up. I thought the worst that could happen would be I'd be thrown out. And in the event, they did a sort of good cop, bad cop. One guy was threatening me, the other was trying to cajole me. But they couldn't prove, I stuck to my cover story as a teacher on sabbatical, improbable as it was. They couldn't prove I was a journalist, so they let me go. But meanwhile, as I was being taken to this basement, I'd managed to get a text to London saying I've just been arrested. And my daughter was still working on the Times at that point. And the night editor, went up to her desk. He said, "Han, just come into my office for a minute." And she went in and he said, "Look, don't panic, don't worry, but your father's been arrested in Homs." And my daughter said, "Oh, he'll love that. That's he'll get a really good story out of this." And I did. I mean, it was sort of made, not only the front page of the Times. So I did about 3 days of sort of non-stop interviews when I came out. So it all worked out fine. But I wouldn't have gone in a year later like that.
In the articles you were writing about Syria, I remember you made an observation which, unfortunately, in a way, turned out to be true. You didn't think the protests against Assad at the time were strong enough because the numbers on the streets were not as many as you'd seen in Egypt and in Libya. And you also said how loyal the Assad army was to Assad, which turned out to be true. Assad regime wasn't thrown overthrown with the protest. But we now got into a situation where the Assad's army wasn't loyal. So it also goes to show that things do change, no matter how unlikely they seem at the time. With your experience in Syria and with hindsight, what do you think happened in Syria? Why did that regime collapse so quickly in the end?
Well, it took 2011 to 25, 14 years for it to collapse.
Yeah.
It's an awfully long time. And I think I was right at the beginning. It was a piecemeal revolution. It wasn't organized. It was so spontaneous, and it spread like a wildfire. But there were still large areas under the regime's control. The regime at that stage was still pretty strong. It was still pretty rich. It wasn't until the Islamic fundamentalists got involved, you started seeing Al-Qaeda and ISIS moving in. Without them, I don't think Assad would have fallen. But in the end, ultimately, then they had support from Iran and Russia. In the end, I think it was Ukraine that did for the regime. Russia had other things on its plate. It could no longer support Assad. And his military was so hollowed out by then. The devastation, the economic devastation in that country, even in the first year, was extraordinary. But this had been going on for 14 years. It was propped up by outside countries. And Iran, of course, Iran was under being clobbered by Israel. Its main sponsors
wasn't in the same position as before to
bolster they weren't in a position to support the Assad regime.
Yeah. But as we speak right now, the Iranian regime is still in its place. Do you still think that the regime in Iran will be overthrown. I remember at the time in 2009 with the Green protests, you kept offering me this thing. You said, like, once the regime is overthrown, we're going to take you to Iran and we're going to go right with you as a sort of like someone who's returned to Iran after many years. And we're going to do that tour. Yeah.
I'm still going to hold you.
You're still going to hold us there?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But do you still think that the regime in Iran will collapse like the Assad regime one day? Do you still have hope that's...
Yeah. Look, regimes don't go gradually, they go suddenly. You know, who foresaw the collapse of the Assad regime? Who foresaw Gaddafi's downfall? It will go, but I think there are two sort of clear and present dangers for the regime. One is Israel is now unrestrained. You know, Trump basically has given Netanyahu the green light to do what he wants, and I think it's well within the bounds of possibility that Israel will launch an all-out attack. You know, they'll seize this moment to destroy the Iranian threat, to destroy its nuclear program. But also the Ayatollah is getting older and older and older. You know, what is he, mid-80s? He's not very well.
Mid-80s, yeah, 85 or 86, I think, yeah.
What happens then?
Well,
you know better than I do.
Yeah, the Assembly of Experts will have to decide a successor for him, which is probably already decided.
Yeah, but look, you know, in the early days, when I first went there, the regime still had a certain amount of legitimacy. I think with the successive uprisings, not just the Green movement, but the ones after Amani.
Massa Amini, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they seem to be getting more regular and more intense.
Yeah.
You know, the regime
but they're still very
is
good
it no longer has much legitimacy. It's kept in place by the Revolutionary Guards and the besieging, by force nowadays. It will go. It's got to go.
They've totally lost their legitimacy, but they're still very efficient in crackdown. But moving on from Middle East, I know you love the Middle East. And you really liked Iran as well, didn't you, as a country?
I would long for the day when I can go back as a tourist to Iran and just drive around it. But even if they gave me a visa now, I wouldn't trust them. They're so capricious. They just, whenever they want a pawn, they just arrest whichever Westerner happens to have the misfortune. Like those couple who were riding across on a motorbike last month.
Yeah. You think that you would?
I don't want to end up in prison.
But you went to so many other countries, and also remember when we were actually working on Iran stories, and then something happened in Chile. There were miners that were trapped, and you had to, at a drop of a hat's notice, you had to book a flight and go to Chile. Anything happened there that was interesting? Because
most journalists spend an awful lot of time covering disasters and wars and nasty things. The Chile story was a highlight because it was a real good news story. So I'm trying to remember the figures. I think something like 60 miners have been trapped a mile beneath the surface of the Atacama Desert by a huge rockfall, and no one thought there was any chance of getting them out. But they had to conduct a research effort, and they sent drills down. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. They were trapped in a tiny sort of cave way below the surface, and they searched, and the families were camped on the top in the desert. And as the weeks and days went past, everyone gave up hope except the families. And the president said, we've got to give this up. And the family said, no, just one more day. And then the drill broke through into the cave, and the miners attached a note saying, we the 44, I think it was, we're still alive. And there was some national rejoicing. But then they had to get them out, and they had to drill 3 sort of cylindrical holes down. Yeah, it was a huge engineering feat, and 2 of them failed and 1 got through. And then came the release. They, one by one, over the course of about 36 hours, they brought these miners up.
And you were there witnessing them coming out.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. I mean, there wasn't a dry eye anywhere in Chile, let alone in the Atacama Desert. Yeah, it was as close to miracle as I've ever seen.
Because you had to fly to Santiago in Chile, the capital of Chile, but the mine was nowhere near there, was there? You had to travel.
No, it was another few hours flight further north. Chile's a very, very long country. Yeah. And then it was out in the middle of the desert.
So there was no hotels or anything to stay?
There was a sort of town, it must have been about an hour away.
So where were you staying?
Well, to begin with, we stayed in the town and we drove out every day. But when the releases happened, we were sort of just, we wanted to be there.
And every one of those miners survived? They were all rescued?
They were all rescued.
Oh, fantastic.
They didn't, some of them suffered mental trauma. Some couldn't cope with the publicity. Some went back down and started mining again. Some turned to God. So they all...
So that was a high point, as you mentioned, because you said journalists normally, they witness disasters, but this was a jubilous event. Any other high points in your career? In your how long were you a foreign reporter? 30 years?
Well, I was on the Times for 30 years, so I did a few years in the lobby doing domestic politics. Then after that, it was all abroad.
So, any other high points?
Well, actually, funny enough, the best 2 weeks of my career on the Times were actually in this country, and that was covering the 2012 Olympics.
Really?
Which were fabulous, because I had I'm not a sports reporter. I was just given a pass, which took me anywhere, into any event. And I was just writing about it as a phenomenon. In fact, even before it started, the Times was the only paper that covered the Olympic torch on every day of its journey around Britain. And it asked all its writers to do a week each. And I said, we all said, we don't want to do this. And they said, no, you've got to. And I got the last week when it came to London. And on the morning of the opening ceremony, I had to be at Hampden Court at about 4:30 in the morning because the torch was coming down the river. And I got there at 4:30 in the morning. And the crowds were so big that people were standing up to their thighs in the water in the Thames to watch this flame. It's just a flame. Set off down the river, and we went down the river. We were in a boat right behind the you remember there was a sort of royal barge carrying the thing. We were in the boat. Every inch of the bank, all the way down, every bridge, every double-decker bus, every balcony was just jam-packed with people banging saucepans and cheering as this flame went past. None of this really got reported because that night, of course, was the opening ceremony, and that sort of took precedence. But I've never seen this country so united and joyous. And that atmosphere persisted for the entire 2 weeks of the Olympic Games.
And it went quite well, didn't it? Everyone was sort of like sceptic to begin with. They thought the London traffic, it was not going to be able to cope with it and everything. But it all went very smoothly, didn't it?
I remember it turned on a sixpence. I remember being at the opening ceremony my job was to write about the flame, who was going to light the flame. We'd all been given our little tasks. And actually, it happened too late. It didn't happen until about 1 a.m. And I was sitting next to Giles Corran, who had been, his job was to write a sketch, or write a description of the opening ceremony. And he'd had to write it in advance because it started much later. They'd been given a briefing about what was going to happen. And it started too late for our first edition. So he'd written this piece in advance, which was being, as we sat there, it was going through the printing presses, and it was really quite snarky, sceptical. And as he watched the opening ceremony, he said, "I've got this all wrong." He sort of went pale and had to rewrite it there and then. But that was echoed in the national mood. Overnight, we suddenly realised that night that we could do this, that it could be a triumph, and it was.
During the 2012 Olympics. Actually, I was invited to be on a BBC World programme to talk about Iran's wrestling team. And I met this reporter from Norway who'd covered the previous Olympic in China. And he made the point, actually, saying that comparing the two Olympics together, saying how relaxed the 2012 Olympic was, how much more fun it was, whereas with the Beijing Olympics, it was everything was very austere, and they had
to. Beijing Olympics were a propaganda exercise.
Absolutely, whereas this was really sort of like a typical British, let your hair down and just be relaxed and have fun sort of thing.
Yeah, in the entire Olympic Park during the Olympics, I think there were 3 petty thefts. That was it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, you were here. You went on the tubes, and everyone was in a great mood. Everyone was talking to each other.
Let's go back to your career again. I mean, over 30 years journalism. So you remember for when it was the print edition, the newspapers had the print edition. There was no electronic version. That how much has journalism changed in those years?
Well, it's changed in two ways. Firstly, the media industry has fragmented. So no one makes money. There's just not the money around. When I started, I had the golden age of journalism when newspapers had loads of money and they'd send you off anywhere at a drop of a hat, and did. But the technology's changed as well. The digital version of the paper is much, much more important than the paper version now. So, I did 8 years in Washington. I'd start early because there was a 5 hours time difference, but I'd finish at 4 because it was 9 o'clock in London. It was a very nice, relaxed lifestyle. If I was there now, it would be a 24-hour job because you're always having to feed the website. And, if Trump tweets something at 2 in the morning, as he often does, you'd have to cover it. So, I'd be exhausted. It's absolutely relentless. And you have to, in those days, all you had to do was be able to write. When I started, we'd phone stories. In fact, when I was in Syria in 2011 for the revolution, I had to dictate my stories back to London because I didn't dare take a laptop with me. And I was amazed you could still do it. Now you have to be, you can file from anywhere with ease, but you also have to do videos and podcasts, and you have to be a multimedia expert now. It's not enough just to be able to write anymore.
So you had more time to do the research and to do the fact check. Do you think the electronic age, because everyone wants to be the first with the story, also makes it more possible for mistakes, factual mistakes, and stories not being well checked?
Well, I think the first thing it does is give you much less time to actually find things out. I mean, firstly, people don't go to places anymore. They find things out by sitting in their screen. They do it. It's not the same at all. Yeah. First rule of journalism, you don't know what you don't know. If you're in doubt, go somewhere. You always find out something you didn't know. You'll meet someone interesting who has a new angle on it. But yes, if you're filing several times a day, you just can't afford the time to go out and talk to people in the street or do interviews or whatever it is. So it's not conducive to good journalism.
So you left the Times, what year was it when you left the Times?
2013.
2013 you retired, and then you carried on as
Not retired.
Not retired. I mean,
reinvented.
Reinvented, yeah. So you were start working as a freelance journalist and writer. You did a lot of your focus was on travelling, and in fact you've got a couple of books on travel. What are your books called? You can plug them in if you want.
They're quite elderly. One was called Almost Heaven, which was actually wrote when I was in Washington, and it was about a journey from Washington right across America through the boondocks. I didn't go anywhere near the cities. It was through the backwaters. And in fact, it was prescient. It was through what is now Trump land. There are two Americas. There's the Americas of the coast, the big cities, pretty liberal. And then there's the backwoods in the middle, which deeply distrust the cities and are very conservative and feel, they always regarded Washington as a den of vipers. And that's the America that Trump very astutely tapped into. No one had paid it much attention before, but he did. And that was his sort of springboard to power. So that was the American book. Then I did one on, after America, we went to Belfast, Northern Ireland for 2 years during the Good Friday, the peace negotiations. And I did a travel book around there. It's the last untamed part of the United Kingdom. You could go Potkin making and cockfighting and poaching and all sorts of things you can't really do in Hertfordshire anymore.
You did that. You went on a rafting trip as well through the Grand Canyon. Am I right?
I did that twice. Yeah.
How did that go?
That was terrific. So you can go down in a tourist boat for a day or something. But what most people don't realise is they allow one private trip a day allocated by, they have a lottery. So if you win the lottery, you can take 16 people and you can take up to, I think it's 22 days to go down the Grand Canyon. And it's fantastic. You don't see a soul for the entire 22 days. You camp on beaches by the river. You raft all morning, and there are fantastic rapids there. And then you camp, and then you hike up these amazing sort of side canyons in the afternoon.
You really are a sort of character that can't sit still, can you?
I'm sitting still right now.
You're sitting still now. This is quite uncomfortable.
Only for you. Only for you.
Thank you. So what else you do?
You're such a thug.
You
You'll beat me up if I...
Mustn't say that. I'm really a nice thug.
No, you are. You're a nice thug. Diva. Why did I start calling you Diva?
Because I was always good at getting you the things that you wanted for the stories, the fact checking, and I used to come up with interesting stories that you thought were good, and getting you quotes and lots of other reasons.
Where would I be without you?
I remember you also said I'm the sort of a thug that you rather have on your side.
You are a thug. You're a troublemaker. You're always stirring up trouble for that nice regime in Iran.
Well, at the moment, to be honest with you, I'm more concerned about the rise of extremism and Islamism in this country, and that's taken up most of my time rather than Iran activities. Because I never thought it could happen like this in this country.
Have you told your viewers how you nearly got arrested at a Palestinian march?
Yes, they've seen the video. That video had 45,000 views, and I did a few interviews with other people, one with John Sakadati, and David Collier wrote about it on his Twitter. Quite a few established journalists, actually, except for you. I was waiting for you to come and say, "Potkin, what happened? Like, let's do something."
I think you should have been arrested. I think they should have locked you up.
Martin, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I think I could do quite a few podcasts with you and talk about all the things that have happened to you over the 30 years, and it's been interesting talking to you on this episode as well. Thank you so much for coming. I know you're a busy man and you had to make time for this, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Nice to be reunited.